Today's talk, I'm just going to be talking about advanced web technologies using React and also how to just become a JavaScript developer, as well as also talking about a bit of Firebase. So a bit about myself. Sorry. So the agenda for today, basically, we're just going to be doing an introduction. I'll be talking about what exactly is React, as well as what is JavaScript, how to become a JavaScript developer, and also talking about Firebase. I'll then take a bit of Q&A sessions, and then I'll also show you a live presentation of some of the projects that I personally have built using React as well as Firebase. So first and foremost, let's jump into the introductions. I go by the name of Koketso, also known as Capfresh for some of you guys. And I'm also a founder of a tech company called Billionaire Developers. I'm also a robotics and a game developer. I'm part of the Microsoft Student Learn Ambassador, as well as a DSC for the University of South Africa. I'm also the UNISA chairperson of Geek Culture Student Society. I was also a build for SDB Facebook mentor, and all rounder. I'm also just a software engineer and a web developer. So the first things first, I'm going to be talking about React and what exactly is React. So React basically, it was actually founded by the software engineers from Facebook, because traditionally Facebook was created on PHP. Now they saw that, it usually takes quite a lot of time to actually render a lot of content on these pages, and it actually caused a lot of lag time. So what the developers of Facebook actually did was then created a new library actually called React, right? So basically React is just as a JavaScript library, right? And it deals a lot with interfaces. And the most important thing you just need to know about React is that it uses UI states, right? So I'm going to just talk about what exactly is all about that. And what it does is that it actually splits all these UI components into its own components and its own states. So just basically looking at the graphs, and this is currently what Google Trends is telling us in terms of popularity and what frameworks and what libraries are currently being used. And we can actually see within this graph that React right now is actually one of the most growing libraries that people are using for the front end development, right? So we're kind of shying away from the traditional way of actually building our websites and actually moving into more websites that are more dynamic, more faster, so that obviously it does not have that lag time whenever you're trying to render a page or trying to upload content onto your web browser, right? So basically the difference between a library and a framework, right? So as I said, React is basically based on a library, right? It's not usually a framework. And basically a framework has the control, right? It has control over the flow of how the website is actually, or actually application that you'll be working on. But with a library, it's actually much lighter, and it actually utilizes all the necessary components that you're going to be needing for your application to actually work properly and much more smoothly. Right. So I spoke about components, right? So basically what components is just UI independent, reusable piece of code or piece of information that is basically a singular piece of that is isolated on its own, right? Of how components actually work. So this is just a typical Twitter page that we're all actually familiar with. You can see we have things like your feeds, your updates, and all of these are actually broken down into singular components, right? And these singular components alone you can actually reuse them without actually rendering the whole page all the time, right? So this is how it actually works in the background. So you actually have your main app where your React application will run from. And as I showed you in the previous slide, you have your navigation bar, your navigation component, your profile component, your trends, and so forth and so forth. And basically, you can also build components on top of components, right? And then the number one thing about this is because we do not want to, number one, spend too much time rendering pages, and number two, to avoid losing data or information that we've just actually about to type into our web browsers, right? So this is how it actually really works in terms of memory, right? So we all know that the most important thing we need to actually bear in mind when we actually create software is having memory as one of your key components when you're actually developing something, right? So what React actually does, it actually does something called a virtual DOM, right? So basically it's like a virtual machine background, which basically acts as like a copy that whenever you actually do something or actually try to change something onto your actual application, what it'll actually do is instead of going all the way into the real DOM, which will actually take time to actually change the component, it actually creates a virtual DOM, which is like a copy in the background. And basically this virtual DOM has a constant communication between your application and the real DOM that actually is built within your system. So in that way, whenever you actually change anything on your application, the virtual DOM will capture that information immediately and subtract all of that lag time that it will actually take from the actual application all the way down to your real DOM, right? So I spoke about what a virtual DOM is. So just to go into a bit more detail, in programming terms, a DOM is basically, it is the concept of the idea of having a virtual representation of the UI in a kept memory, right? So as I explained, it's all about killing the whole time between your application and going all the way down to the real DOM, which is actually built in your systems. And this is also very key because especially if you're going to be using things like APIs or just using like web scraping technologies and so forth. And obviously, in this sense, it makes all our applications run more faster. Know that React is all about state changes, right? So more about what exactly I spoke that React basically is a library from JavaScript. And I'm presuming that most of us are actually quite familiar what JavaScript is all about. But basically JavaScript, it is a text-based programming language that is used both on the client and the server side, right? It actually helps us to interact with our web pages and also to help us to really add really cool functionalities onto our applications and so forth. So just looking at the current opportunities and the job markets of what is actually how becoming a JavaScript developer is right now in South Africa. So this is just some stats that I pulled off the net just to actually see how much potential and how much of a need there really is to be a need for JavaScript developers as well as React. So there's quite a lot of companies that are actually looking for a lot of JavaScript developers currently right now, and especially with the whole pandemic, a lot of companies and businesses are looking to obviously go online. So obviously they will need a developer in that sense. And so I'm just going to basically talk about the roadmap of how to actually become a fully fledged JavaScript developer. So first and foremost, you actually need to know the basics of web development, which is basically the two components, which is HTML and CSS. So HTML, we all know that it helps you to structure what your website actually is going to look like. And then obviously the CSS is all about styling and adding things like margins, borders, colors, and just making things look much more professional in that sense. Then you'd move on to JavaScript. And JavaScript then also helps you with user interaction and obviously interacting with your web pages. It helps you to capture things like data and obviously to send requests and so forth. And last but not least, you will then move on to becoming a React developer. Right. So this is one of my personal journeys of that I actually took before becoming a JavaScript developer. Is that I spoke in the previous slide to actually you need to master the basics. Master the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then obviously you'd want to apply to either boot camps, seminars, or um, those sorts. You can go to colleges, you can go to try to get join some sort of a community that's going to actually help you to actually build your confidence in building projects. And the third thing you want to do is actually build real world projects and actually work on actually creating an online profile. That's also another thing that I really emphasize on people that are trying to enter the web development space, is that try to create an online profile for yourself. And last but not least is also then try to build real world projects that can actually help you to land your developer job, or actually to impress clients if you're trying to go the freelancing route. And these are just some of the top companies right now that are actually currently using React as their front end technologies. So you see, big companies like Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Twitter, Google, Uber, and the list just goes on and on and on. Because the thing is, with these big companies, there's a lot of users that are being used, as well as there's a lot of information that you need to be able to track, and you also don't want to be losing very valuable data whenever people want to use these applications. So React, in that sense, is a powerful way to actually manage and to reuse the data, the code, while you're actually using these applications. Right. So then I spoke about Firebase. So Firebase, for me, when I discovered Firebase, I was like, thank goodness, we don't have to actually worry too much about the back end side of things. So that's what Firebase is mostly all about. It's a Google technology that actually works both for the web and for mobile applications. So it was actually adapted by Google in 2014. And what you can actually use Firebase for is things like authentication. You can use real-time databases. You can also host your websites online and so forth. And it has data analytics. So it actually tells you how many, it keeps track how many people have actually logged onto your website. It tells you if your website has crashed, so the security part of it is also quite very, very impactful. But I personally use Firebase for all those reasons that I told you about, which is the authentication, using the real-time database, which is really, really helpful in that sense. So I think before I jump into the Q&A session, I think I'll just quickly jump into my demonstration. Obviously, do please make sure that you stay in touch with myself. So these are all my handles and my profiles and everything. You guys can check out the stuff that I've been doing, all the projects I'm also involved in, all the other organizations that I work with, and so forth. So just before I jump into the Q&As, I think this is the perfect time to actually show you some live demos that I've actually created so far. Right. So that actually just closes the end of my presentation, and I will just quickly jump into the demo side of things. Right. So the first things first is, guys, so this is basically the website that I actually created myself. This is my online profile, which actually showcases all the different types of projects I've worked on. Most of them, right, I've built using React and so forth. So the three that I actually want to talk about is actually the Windows 10, the COVID-19, as well as the Tinder dating app web application. So with the COVID-19 track, and as I said, as you can actually see, if you can see that when I'm scrolling on the right-hand side, the whole page actually does not get affected with whatever I'm trying to do. And even if I try to actually look for certain stats of a certain country, you can actually see that the interactive map also does not interfere with all the other necessary information that is actually needed, that actually is being displayed onto the screen. And this is very important because you don't want every time you try to do a certain change on your website, all of a sudden the whole page has to render once again. This is just a very, very good way to actually show reusable code. All right. So even if we try to go to see South African stats, it actually shows the current COVID-19 stats in terms of the cases, recoveries, and deaths right now. So this is just a really cool application that I used. I also used a bit of an API that actually helps me to draw the information onto the applications and so forth. And as you can also see on the bottom right, this is just the current stats worldwide, and this is real-time information, right? And the second one that I want to show you is just a simple Windows 10 clone that I actually just built in React. It's nothing too fancy, but as you can see, whenever I just press certain things, like the whole page doesn't really render. I keep reiterating this thing because that is one of the most powerful things about React, is that and also your application just seems a bit smoother in that sense. So this is just another application that I just built. It's just a Windows 10 clone. And finally, I created a Tinder application, which is obviously you can swipe left and you can swipe right. This doesn't really mean anything. It's not saying yes or no to any people that I'm trying to date over here, but it's just to show you how these companies are really using the applications to actually enhance the performance of the application. So even if you try to go into the chat section, you will see that you see the whole transition of the smoothness of how and the transition of how the whole applications do work. And you can also just fool around with all the other applications that I've actually created just using React. So I've got like Facebook, Airbnb, WhatsApp, Google, I've got Amazon's, I've got Netflix's, YouTube's, and so forth. So